Hello everyone. When Siobhan Macaulay first contacted me to ask if I would speak here, my initial thought was no way. Northampton was too distant, I was too fragile, and what could I possibly tell you lot that you don't know already? But Siobhan said something in the email that hooked me. She said, this kind of physio is like pushing a pea uphill with your nose. I thought it was a brilliant image, and it immediately cheered me up because I'd been making such slow progress. So I decided to come in the hope that anything I say here can help you to inspire more patients to keep pushing that pea, and also to thank you as a profession for what you've done for me. Briefly, for those of you who don't know my story, 2 years ago I was on my horse approaching a small cross-country jump when he refused, and I made the fatal mistake of trying to hold on to him, trying to grab him round the neck, with the result that my face was the first thing to hit the ground, and my neck broke as my body flipped on top. Although the vertebrae went back into place, C6 was unstable and chipped, and T12 was fractured, though the cord wasn't compromised at T12. I was operated on to have a plate put in the front of my neck, and because of the inflammation, I was then on a ventilator for some time. Then I got pneumonia, and that was my first memory of Susan Gillespie, my physiotherapist. After I came off the ventilator, this small, smiley person appeared, and she stuck an extremely irritating Hoover nozzle in my mouth and told me to cough. And she seemed extraordinarily overjoyed by the sight of green phlegm. And it's true. She claims she used to stretch my legs too every day and that we'd have long conversations, but I'm not sure if I believe her because I simply can't remember any of that. Let me tell you a bit about Susan. I call her the Hobbit. She comes from the Shire, if not Bag End. When I stand up, I'm 6 foot tall, when I stand up she reaches my waist. And like all you physios, she's callous, ruthless, intolerant of excuses, has a very black sense of humor, and doesn't do tears. What are you blubbing about now, she used to say. Stop crying and get working. And I respect her so much because underneath the toughness, I knew she really cared. And I tell you that she's actually a really kind, sensitive person, but it would ruin her career. So I won't. Anyway, we had chemistry. She toughened me up emotionally, gave me hope, and she tried as hard as I did to keep finding ways to make progress. In the year I spent in hospital, we worked out that she devoted about 800 hours to my rehabilitation. As she says, she'd have done less time for murder. She's here today, as is the head of physio at the Glasgow Spinal Unit, John Hassler. John is a Jedi Knight, we're just not sure which one. When I look at him, I think of Yoda. However, he prefers Obi-Wan Kenobi. Either way, he's a man in whom profound knowledge lies. I intend to talk for less than my allotted time so that you can ask them questions, because they know more than I do. One of the important things to say about spinal injury is the patient's initial gap between perception and reality. You don't have a clue how serious your injury is. You lie there in high dependency and a haze of morphine thinking, well, I'll just have to get to the gym and then I'll start recovering, won't I? I was in serious denial. I didn't grasp the fact my hands didn't work anymore, let alone that I couldn't sit up or that I was doubly incontinent. I was just convinced I was temporarily inconvenienced, and to be honest, I still think a bit that way. I'm afraid I'm a classic example of what Lisa Harvey was talking about, a spinal patient with unrealistic expectations, and I found her talk absolutely fascinating. My consultant, Morel Purcell, and Susan told me, prepare for life in a wheelchair. And I lay there and disagreed politely and said I was going to get better. Early on, I remember very clearly asking Susan, I'm going to be able to walk on crutches, right? And she was very blunt. She said, people who use crutches have torso muscles, which you don't. And even they tend to give up because the effort is too great. I just decided she was wrong. In fact, I decided to prove the whole damn lot of them wrong. Unbeknownst to me, I'd been assessed as Asia A. I reckon it took about 2 months for the severity of my situation to sink in. There was one point early on when I was on a hand bike next to a patient called Andrew, who was on a leg bike. "How come you can go on that and not me?" I asked him enviously. "Because I'm incomplete," Andrew said mysteriously. "You'll probably be complete unless they've told you otherwise." I gawped at him. Complete? Incomplete? It was the first time I'd heard the expression. I was fascinated, jealous, hungry for information. It was like being a kid and finding out that some of your mates have been given a big bag of sweeties, and you haven't. I asked Susan. "You're complete," she said. "Your big challenge is going to be to see if you can transfer." I spent a year in hospital. Most of that year I was like the comedian Matt Lucas in Little Britain. You know the sketch of the chap in the wheelchair who keeps saying, "On that one, on that one." I started to go around eyeing up all the machines and infuriating Susan by saying, "Why can't I go on that?" And she'd say, exasperated, "Because you can't." "Why not?" I said. And I used to point at the Locomat and the Arjo and the parallel bars and the gutter frame and the Zimmer and the crutches. And I nagged her, and she dismissed it. And you know what? I've done them all except the crutches, and they're my goal for 2012. I lived for the gym. I hated being on the ward. On the ward, there was a woman in the bed next to me, same age, 54, same level of injury, perfectly lovely woman, but her priority was getting her hair and makeup done. And it was like bloody Vidal Sassoon every morning. And I'd lie there, trussed in my collar and my back brace, grinding my teeth in frustration as the nursing auxiliaries did her blow dry, because it meant that I was late for the gym. Because the gym was my salvation. It was there I discovered that I too was incomplete, but it took a very long time. There were some key things in my recovery. The first was FES, to strengthen my left wrist, which would be essential if I was ever to transfer. So in hand therapy every day, I had a FES to allow my gammy left wrist to flex up so I could weight bear. I worked hard on the hand bike and the arm machines. And 3 months to the day after my accident, I managed to transfer from a plinth into my wheelchair. I didn't realize Susan had been setting it up all week, the sideways shuffle along the plinth towards the board and the chair. And in fact, I did it without realizing on a Friday afternoon. "It's a Friday miracle," she cried. Needless to say, I burst into tears. I cried at most things. She just laughed at me. And you know, in the spinal gym, there's that bizarre, ever-present mix of deep emotion and gallows humor. Shortly after that, my toes started wiggling. I remember very shyly showing Susan, and she called over Willie Stewart, who's one of the other physios, to watch my toes. And it was typically surreal. I had tears of elation running down my face, and Willie, who's a repository for every trivial pursuit's answer in the world, peering at my toes and saying, "Yes, very interesting, but what was the title of ABBA's second #1 hit?" And I also remember how carefully Susan managed my expectations over those toes, quoting percentages at me. Without proprioception, which I didn't have, there was, if I recall rightly, only a 16% chance of walking again. Then I began to get flickers in my quads and adductors, and that's when the FES took over my life in earnest. I spent hours, days, weeks on a microstim machine, mostly side-lying under a cage with my legs in slings and hoists, doing reps of 10 quad and hamstring exercises. I was on it every day, and I gave it my all. I frequently fell asleep, to be woken by the heartless hobbit. "Ha! Sleeping on the job," she used to cry. I also had 6 sessions on an FES bike, which was helpful but horrendously overcomplicated with internet access, etc. I think it was designed by men. Hydrotherapy was another wonderful thing. It was in the pool that I first realized I could step my legs. I also stood up for the first time holding the poolside. And Bad Ragaz exercises, they were very useful too. Not with Susan, because she was too short to stand up in the pool. Then, if I remember rightly, Susan used me as a guinea pig on a weekly training session with the other physios, asking them for ideas. That's when, courtesy of John Hassler, I first stood upright on dry land, standing up from a raised plinth to the parallel bars, with John in front of me and Susan behind me. I think at this point, poor Susan had to concede that A, I was the slowest incomplete injury in history, and B, she wasn't going to get rid of me in 6 months. What happened with me did happen incredibly slowly. I spent what seemed like endless months on a standing frame, fighting low blood pressure and learning to lock my knees. Once the knees were stable, thanks to repeated FES on the quads, I started learning to stand from a raised plinth to a standing frame, up and down by myself 6 times in 30 minutes. I also went on a machine called an Ergo to try and defeat my dizziness. I mentioned the Lokomat earlier. Quite simply, I think every patient with spinal or neurological problems, if they're incomplete, should have access to one. I credit the Lokomat with making the breakthrough for me, or at least accelerating the process by months. When I was first measured by the Lokomat, it was by bioengineers who were going to use me for a respiratory experiment. To hell with my lungs, I thought. I just want on that machine. To my immense disappointment, they found that my femurs were too long, simply outwith the parameters for the machine. 2 months later, measured by John and Susan, I found that my femurs had miraculously shrunk, and I could use it. Funny that, but it just shows you the power of a Jedi Knight. And it also shows you why physios rather than bioengineers should use these machines. I have to tell you that the first time I had those cuffs strapped around my legs and saw myself in the mirror walking on a moving treadmill, it literally felt like an explosion in my head, in my brain. 10 months after my accident, I could hear my brain saying, "So that's how you walk. Now I remember." I started off with 10-minute sessions in which the machine bore all my weight and did all the walking for me. But every time I used it, I tried to work with the machine, and Susan lowered the percentage of effort it was making. I had 3 sessions a week for 3 months, and the results were startling. By the end, I was carrying more than 60% of my body weight and striding out at 1.5 kilometers an hour for up to 30 minutes. Off the machine, as a result, I'm sure, my hip flexors started working for the first time. Susan got me some AFOs to stop my toes from dragging, and wearing the AFOs, I was tried on the Arjo for the first time, with 3 physios helping. And I shuffled from plinth to pillar, maybe 6 steps. When I sat down, I swear Susan's eyes were moist. I was just gormless. She was furious. "Nothing makes me madder than a patient who doesn't realize what they've achieved," she told me through gritted teeth. Pretty soon, I could go the length of the gym on the Arjo, and then I got to try the things she said I'd never use, the gutter frame. Before I left hospital, I discovered I could just stand from my wheelchair onto the parallel bars. But what held me back terribly was the pain in my damaged hands. Putting weight on them remains to this day a constant battle, as does fatigue and stamina. It was time to go home. I left with the gutter frame and a set of AFOs, angry that I couldn't shuffle symbolically through the exit doors. I was also seriously grumpy that I hadn't quite made it to Asia D, no matter how much I tried to bribe Susan. At home, I had a plinth and parallel bars, and soon my next big milestone, courtesy of Emma, my community physio, was being able to stand up from my chair and walk along the bars. On my 3-month checkup visit to the spinal unit, Susan whipped me into the gym and got me up on a red dot bariatric frame, a waist-high one. I recommend this frame, an excellent thing. 2 wheels at the front, stoppers at the back, and it's really stable. On it, I was able to walk across the gym. In the last year, the milestones have continued to creep by. The P is still going uphill. I'm now able to stand up to the red dot frame from my wheelchair. I no longer use the gutter frame or the AFOs. My feet are lifting. 2 years after my injury, with the red dot frame, I can walk 20 meters inside the house and go up and down a ramp between rooms. I can stand for an hour a day in the I stand for an hour a day in the standing frame. I leg bike for an hour, half of it passively, half of it actively. And I use a Norwegian machine called a Topro Taurus. It's like an Argio walker with a battery. I use it statically, just learning to stand by myself, legs straight, hips unsupported. It's a fantastic thing. This week I had Botox on my right adductor to stop my foot from trying to cross over so much. And lack of proprioception and sore hands still frustrate me, but I keep going. I now have input from 3 physios. Susan comes to see me occasionally to push me out of my comfort zone and cheer me up. Emma Forbes, my community physio, comes once a week and has been a wonderful positive support. Kenny Toms, who runs a business called Neurophysio Scotland, comes once a week and manipulates and stretches me. He focuses very much on my gait. And I'm still seeing improvements. I go to riding for the disabled once a week, and this is helping my core strength and balance enormously. The motion of the horse really loosens up my pelvis, and after riding I can walk further, and actually my legs are soft enough for me to be able to get them into the car. I really recommend riding for spinal injuries, for the torso. I've talked for long enough, but a couple of things before I open up to questions. I'd like to take issue with the use of the word functional. I don't think I've ever been angrier than I was the day I returned to the ward after one of my first walks. And a senior nurse said, "I hear you walked. It won't be functional, of course." Now, I could have murdered her, but I could only sort of give her a death stare. The word should be banned. Functional is used dismissively, almost by, non-functional is used dismissively, almost by NHS staff who want your bed vacated. It becomes a weapon against people trying. That's not functional, there's no point in doing it. If I realized how little I've done in 2 years was in itself functional, I'd never have kept going. Only now am I getting to the point of functionality. Another thing that makes me angry are timescales, another invidious thing which the NHS tries to force upon neurological injuries, obviously for budget reasons. And of course there are some spinal injuries from which there is no recovery, no matter how hard you try. I understand that. But if you are incomplete, and I understand that more and more patients are, one of the biggest myths surrounding neurological injury, which I want to challenge, is the timescale of recovery. I can't remember how I learnt, whether it was from health staff or a fellow sufferer, but one of the earliest things I absorbed in hospital was that the first 6 months were the window for spinal recovery. If things were going to happen, basically, they would happen then. After that, you'd had your chips. Thus it was, 6 months after my accident, I was sitting in the day room of the spinal unit, sunk in deep gloom because I was not yet performing river dance, not even with my fingers, and convinced that all hope was lost, when the director of the unit, David Allen, stopped to speak to me. And I told him why I was so low. And he said, "This 6 months thing is so wrong." He said, "I do wish people would stop using it." And I do wish they would too. So I'm going to be a little bit provocative, especially with regard to what Lisa Harvey said. I suspect there's a bit of an institutionalized poverty of optimism surrounding neurological damage. And it's fueled by the professional requirement not to raise false hope, not to mention the financial pressures. It costs a massive amount to treat spinal injuries, and 6 months goals are doubtless encouraged by NHS target setters. I therefore decided to defy other people's expectations altogether. It was a conscious decision that false hope was preferable to no hope. And it's worked for me. I clung to letters and emails I received from readers who'd suffered spinal injury or brain injury. And hope fluttered out of brief lines and phrases. Quote, "It was ages before my gammy hand improved." Quote, After 7 years, I can walk around the house on a frame. Quote, getting new tingles after 10 years. Quote, 14 years ago, I couldn't move at all or smile or talk. Now I can do all three. I have to say from long experience that doctors, nurses and physios all said I would have no recovery. And they often predict wrong. Quote, 2 years after I came out of hospital, things are moving and I'm ready to start my rehab. Quote, still noticing tiny improvements after 5 years. Recently, I heard from a reader who's become a friend. She, a few years older than me, damaged her neck badly in a riding accident. She wrote, it was the 4th anniversary of my accident on December 16. I'm still improving. It's slow and often hard to discern, but I know I am. I'm standing upright for longer periods. I have almost perfect footfall pattern. I'm now swimming on my front. I'm driving so much better. I can feel the brake pedal. My bladder's behaving well. My bladder's behaving well and my bowels are virtually back to normal and ceasing to be a worry. I'm walking without sticks more and more. She was pretty incomplete, very much incomplete. But please ban the 6 months, the year, the 18-month pigeonholes. Just tell people with incomplete injuries they'll be in recovery for the rest of their lives. Just imagine what you could do if you had the time and the resources to continue helping people. It must frustrate you. And it's why I'd like to see spinal units doing outpatients. I think it's very sad that there isn't more capacity. Never forget what power you guys have to inspire. My friendships with the physios and the OTs were my salvation, sustaining me over my year in hospital. So never underestimate the psychological influence you have over your patients. Sure, you mustn't give false hope, but you must continue to encourage hope. And I think that's a really important distinction. My job as a writer put me in a position to have a voice, but I don't think I possess any more mental strength or determination than a whole lot of other people. The challenge for you guys is finding it and mining it. And if there are any questions, I'd like to take them and I'll happily deflect them to John and Susan.